Hey there. This will be my 5th video. Wanted to talk about a topic that I think we can all relate to. In fact, I know a lot of us are contending with this issue because I have seen it repeatedly in different discussion forums and even in the message thread of my own videos. And that is this problem that faces a lot of different people who were raised in a very religious context, which is that it's very difficult to distinguish between what ideas and conclusions you've reached of your own volition and which ones are just like vestigial remnants of your childhood. So, for example, someone raised in an extremely strict Catholic family or evangelical family might still hold on to the fear of burning eternally in hellfire, despite having reached the conclusion that all of these doctrines and dogmas are false. As adults, they could still just harbor this sort of unconscious emotional sensation that hell is a real place and that it's something to fear. And I don't think it's that difficult to understand if you know a few things about child development. And child development is basically the idea that the first few years of your life and the earlier on in your life you're introduced to various feelings or topics, the more likely they are to resurface and resonate throughout the rest of your life. So anyone who doubts this, just look at videos of children who suffer from attachment disorders, who missed out on critical periods of their early life and infancy. And they're really tragic and depressing to watch these interviews with these young adults or kids who really just became sociopaths because they lacked empathy and just the ability to form any real connections with anyone else because they missed that window of early development that is so critical to your life. One way to think of it is your very first impressions of the world that are being formulated in your mind are reference points and anchors for all of the other attachments and connections you're going to make. So it's sort of like the foundation or the lattice upon which other connections will be made. I keep saying connections, I mean like neurological pathways that that start developing before you're even born. But the initial pathways that come into being when you first enter the world are critical because those are the anchors from which you will extend out and branch out and make new connections in your mind and come to new conclusions and, figure out how your hands work and your feet and all of that. It's all layered upon layers and layers of whatever your first impressions of the world were. And that is true, well into your teen years. It becomes less and less critical the older you get. But those first initial, extremely impactful moments of your life resonate forever. They're imprinted on you. Literally imprinted, like a goose or geese. Geese will, when they're first born, become imprinted to not only their mother, but the location that they are born into. So they will frequently return home to that initial location, that whatever body of water or lake it was. No matter how far away they've flown, in other areas of their life, they will return home to that body of water because it's what they know. And our minds tend to do that. We go back to those childhood states and those initial feelings and impressions of the world. In fact, I actually happen to think that relates to another question that's sort of off topic, but it's my personal opinion, unfounded opinion without any evidence, so make of it what you will. And please give me feedback if you've heard of this elsewhere, or if you have any credible reasons to dismiss this. But I kind of think one of the explanations for why religion and God are so universal across all cultures and all periods of time throughout human history has a lot to do with that fact, that imprint factor of our first impression of the world. So the boilerplate response when heavy hitters that are outspoken against religion, like Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and Harris, they will say that religious belief, or the tendency towards religious belief, is a product of how advantageous it is to assign intention to what are really random events. So you imagine two ancestors strolling across a field in Africa, and they hear a rustle in the bushes. And the first ancestor thinks, a potential ancestor thinks, that's the wind, or something must have fell out of a tree. That's what that noise was. And the second ancestor thinks, no, those bushes were moved intentionally. Someone or something with intention moved those bushes. The latter is more likely to survive and pass on their genes. And over time, it would just become integrated into your thought process that anything that happens is happening for a reason, and there must be intention behind it. And because those that fail to instantly apply that kind of thinking are more likely to get eaten or die in some other way at the hands of an adversary or something. So that's the common explanation given for the universal nature, that there's some sort of survival benefit to belief. So those ancestors would also be prone to assigned intention to, like, lightning or the wind itself, or just whatever, looking for meaning and intention behind every random event in the universe. But I actually think it goes a little bit further than that. I think that the actual sensation of feeling the presence of another being hovering around is a real thing. And I think people actually do feel that. And I think it has more to do with the fact that, that by virtue of surviving infancy, your initial impression of the world is that there's someone looking out for you, that there is a wiser, more powerful being that you can't comprehend in your mother or father or other kind of caretaker or whatever. So even before you can speak any words, you have this feeling. And that feeling of these caretakers is the lattice upon which all of your other ideas are formed. Your entire understanding of the world initiates with the sensation of having someone take care of you. And that sensation never really goes away. If an infant who's 2 or 3 or 4 years old were attacked by crows at, let's say, 2 years old, they may not actually retain the memories of that attack. They might not visualize what happened. It's forgotten. But what isn't forgotten is the experience of that attack, the emotional impact it made. And a child that was attacked under those circumstances may grow up to have an irrational phobia of birds or flying airplanes or anything that moves overhead, and just have this inexplicable fear of birds and stuff like that. And it's not like you could easily reason that person out of that, because they were never reasoned into it in the first place. You can't be reasoned out of what you were never reasoned into in the first place. So really it's just the sensation of how the birds make them feel, because they had this experience before they could barely speak. And I am of the opinion that our initial experience, although not traumatic and negative of the world, is more of a positive caretaker experience. Gives us the irrational sensation that that caretaker is still hovering around somewhere. Because it's so early on, and because it made such a huge impact on a pivotal period of your life. So, like an amputee can sometimes report still feeling the sensation of having toes and wiggling them, even though he has no toes anymore. You still feel tingling in his toes. And that's really because the sensation of having toes in the first place is all in our mind. It's not, it ultimately has to go through our mind for us to comprehend it. So when the toes are gone, the possibility of feeling them is still there, and is still very real. Because you had a leg this whole time, and once it's gone, your brain doesn't always catch up. And I have a feeling, I think that it's possible that just by virtue of having that major impact of having a caretaker, even when they're gone, even though you might assign it a new personality other than your parents' personality, that sensation, that warm and fuzzy feeling, is every bit as real as the sensation of the tingling toes. Not that the toes are there, but you can't deny that it really feels like they are. Anyway, that's kind of a side note, but I think that might also account for, in addition to the whole intentionality state of mind, that the fact that just surviving infancy means you have your first impressions of the world are everything else is built upon your first impression of having someone looking out for your interests and caring for you. Basically wires your mind and preps you for adulthood, when someone might come along and fill in that void, that sensation, with whatever cultural religion is offered to you. But again, if you have any feedback on that, I'd love to hear it. It's not really what I intended to talk about. But what I was going to talk about does kind of relate to that, which is that just like in the case of the Catholic kid that grows up to still fear hell even though he doesn't believe in Catholicism, many of the people in this community still have the emotional sensation and sometimes the literal belief that we are living in the last days and the world is coming to an end. And even if you don't actually believe it, you still kind of feel that way. And I thought it would be helpful to just discuss the likelihood of that even being the case. So I think it's a residual effect of our upbringing, the same way fear of hellfire is a residual effect to Catholics, because they don't, none of us can relate to that concern. None of us are afraid of burning eternally in hell, because that's not what was drummed into us as kids. Instead, what was drummed into us is this matter-of-fact statement, which is still being made over and over again across the country, across the planet, that people will start off a talk without even giving any evidence for the idea. They'll start off a talk just by saying, if you don't recognize that these are the last days that we're living in, then you're just not paying attention. As if it's just a fact. Obviously, we all know we're living in the last days, without providing any real evidence for that statement. So do we have evidence for that statement? Well, what are the claims that are on offer regarding the idea that we are living in the last days? I know that I have had sort of flashbacks, and I feel like I'm pretty well grounded and secure in the knowledge that it's all nonsense. But even I have had emotional flashbacks to these kind of feelings, including when just recently when I learned that Russia was banning the witnesses again. I ran that through the prism of my upbringing and thought about how that might fit into the end of the world dynamic, and was thinking, well, Putin has this sort of bromance / puppet master relationship with Trump, and if he bans the witnesses, then maybe he'll pull some kind of string and make Trump do it too. And that was a very fleeting, temporary idea, and even if I thought it through, it wouldn't make much sense to worry about being on the wrong side of the organization, since in their literature, the first religions to be attacked would be the false religions, and the final religion to be attacked would be God's true organization. So even if that were the case and they got attacked by the government, it ought to give you pause and make you think I better start searching for a different group. But all that aside, just the idea that it occurred to me in the first place to even think that far into it is a product of my upbringing. And there were other times in my life where it was a lot more serious than that, where it was a real battle between my emotional tendency to consider these the end times versus my logical, rational self reasoning my way through it. So about 2 months after I left and was on my own 2 feet and solid in the knowledge that I had made the right decision, and I was no longer being misled, and I had all these concrete reasons for why the way I grew up wasn't the truth. 2 months later, 9/11 happened. And something that extreme on the world stage taking place, some event that major and catastrophic, I think a lot of different denominations tried to break it down through the prism of their individual religious ideologies. And in my case, I thought, well, what if as a result of this they ban all extremist religions, and then as a result of that it's kind of like a slippery slope, and then they start banning moderate religions, and then sure enough government has fully turned on religion and its fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and here I am, having recently made the terrible mistake of leaving the protection I would have had in the organization, about to witness all of the Bible prophecy being fulfilled, and I'm so stupid, how could I have done this? That crossed my mind a time or two during the aftermath of 9/11. But even then, I was able to just sort of stick to the facts and reason my way through it, and it was never so moved that it pushed me back in the wrong direction, even though I was emotionally inclined to go running back because it was a chaotic time, and nobody knew for sure what the outcome was going to be. But so going back, the point is we have a tendency to emotionally go back to the body of water we grew up in. When major events happen, and even when they don't, there's just these sort of minor flashbacks. And I think it might be useful just to go through the breakdown of all the reasons you might have thought it was we're living in the last days, and see if there's any validity to that claim. So, why did I think we were living in the last days when I did? Well, besides the fact that everybody around you, all the adults and everyone, just sort of took it as a fact that, of course, these are the last days. There's no doubting that, no way. There were some things they pointed to as evidence. So, earthquakes and pestilence and food shortages, and men will be lovers of money rather than God, selfish, no natural affection, animalistic. Well, let's take some of these claims. Food shortages in one place after another. Are we living in a time where there are more food shortages than any other time? Oh, before I get into that, probably one of the favorite prophecies is the idea that in those days people will say nothing has changed since the creation's beginning onward, which of course is a little bit like prophesying that the sky will be blue in those days, because even if things do continue the same as they always have, then of course that's what people will be saying. So it's very much a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, that's not what I'm about to say. I don't think things have continued the same since creation's beginning onward. And let me explain why. Food shortages in one place after another. For the first time in all of human history, no matter where you live on planet Earth, or almost anywhere you live on planet Earth, the majority of all populations are more likely as individuals to die from overeating than lack of food. We've never lived in a period like that, of such nutritional abundance in all of history. And that includes the fact that just within the last 30 years, extreme poverty has been cut in half. And we are well on the way to eliminating the other half within our lifetimes. That has never been the case in global history. And it's due solely to the scientific advancements and ingenuity of the scientific method. We have figured out how to use machinery to do most of the labor, and very smart technologies to to grow crops and animals and very limited space. We can grow crops in the middle of the desert. There's a project called Jungle in the Desert. And a lack of food is less and less a problem every year. It's becoming cheaper, more readily available, and our generation is one of the most fortunate when it comes to the issue of having something to eat. Not so long ago, the majority of labor was related to agriculture and struggling just to feed yourself and your family by the sweat of your brow. And now a tiny fraction of people work in actual food production, thanks to science. So we've cut extreme poverty and starvation in half in the last 30 years. And even before that, it had been trending downward consistently, and now it seems very realistically in view that we will completely eradicate it within our lifetimes. So you can take that sign of the end and uncheck that box. Food shortages are not an issue, at least not in this generation. How about earthquakes? That one was kind of a big one for me, because I remember repeating the statistic that earthquakes have increased tenfold starting around the year 1914. And that argument killed two birds with one stone. It meant there's a lot of validity to the 1914 date, and it meant that we are living in the time of the end. And I never thought to question that statistic, because you would have to have a lot of balls to make a claim like that without having any evidence. And why would I doubt them anyway? But it turns out there's no way they could have made that claim with any evidence. They literally just pulled it out of the air, because all the places that you would get those stats from say nothing of the kind. They don't just say earthquakes haven't increased tenfold. They say they haven't increased at all, consistently, for centuries. And it's not like the organization has its own seismographs and Richter scales where they could do some competing source of information. The only place they could go to get the information is someplace you can also go online and discover for yourself that no, earthquakes have not increased. On average, there's been about one major earthquake a year ever since they've been documenting it, and even ancient times it seems consistent with that. One major earthquake and several little ones. One thing that has changed is that earthquakes generally cause far less damage than they ever have before. So they might be roughly equivalent in their whatever they rate on the Richter scale. But because of the advancements of science and the scientific method, there are far fewer earthquake-related fatalities because of early warning systems and building code and preparation. So if you wanted to look for a period in history where earthquakes were causing lots of damage, you wouldn't look to this century. The last century was worse, and I'm pretty sure records indicate the century before that was even worse, but you might want to double check me on that. But the least impacted as far as life or death earthquake scenario is like the last 80 years or whatever. So you can take earthquakes off the list. They haven't increased, and they're causing fewer deaths than they did in the past. How about violence? Well, watching the news, it may appear as if violence is rampant and on the rise. And that's because the news has the motto, if it bleeds, it leads. So when there's good news about how violence has declined for the 10th consecutive year or something like that, it's never reported. What gets reported are mass shootings, speaking specifically about America. And in America, we have more gun violence than any other first world nation. But even with the mass shootings and everything taken into account, the sheer murder rate, including gun violence, has been declining year after year after year after year. And globally, that is true as well. So that might sound like a crazy claim, but just look into it. Violence is down. Um, our generation is less violent than the baby boomer generation. And, the generation before that was the first couple of world wars. And the generation before that was, I don't know, lynching black people. And before that, it was wiping out an entire continent of indigenous people. So yeah, we've been steadily decreasing our levels of violence. I understand how that might not sound true, because if you watch the news, it seems like crazy. But if you really want to learn about this stuff, I suggest Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, because it goes in a real detailed study of a lot of the things related to violence throughout the course of history. In fact, I think the title of that book is Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. How about just morality in general? The millennial generation is less promiscuous, less teen pregnancy, and less abortions than baby boomers. And the good old days were not so good when it comes to morality. Like I just mentioned earlier, we treated other races horrifically. Even if you're comparing some humans at our worst, times of war, compare the two wars we're engaged in right now to Vietnam. The death toll now is much lower, especially given the many, many years that we've been at war. And the stated goals and targets are far more precise and less violent. There was outrage and huge public relations disaster over the fact that we were waterboarding prisoners in this most recent war. Waterboarding is really mild compared to the things that were happening in Vietnam. Waterboarding is simulated drowning, but it's not drowning. In Vietnam, we were melting people's skin off, civilians, indiscriminately. Far more people died. There were many cases of just rape and slaughter. Unfortunately, a lot of the good soldiers paid a price for that when they came home, because these reports had come back to the States, and they were spit on and treated terribly because they were all just lumped in as one terrible group of people. But Vietnam is pretty tame compared to, the treatment of Jews by Germany. And that is pretty tame compared to the treatment advocated by the writers of the Bible during wartime, where you kill the men, women, and children, and you keep the virgin girls for yourself, and by the way, kill all the horses too, and all the cattle, and just practices in warfare. If anybody acted the way that they were admonished to behave in biblical wars by the author of the Bible, it would turn our stomachs, and they would be in prison for serious war crimes, if not executed. We have no tolerance for that kind of behavior nowadays. And wartime, that is when we are at our worst. And even our wars are being fought far more morally than any point in history. Thanks in part to just changing zeitgeist and intolerance for cruelty, and also just the availability of information, being able to see what's going on the other side of the world. You can't get away with as much if you want to be a cruel sergeant or whatever. So, violence, morality, I mean, if you want to talk about animalistic, selfish morality, just compare the modern world to what we did to the natives of the continent I'm sending this video from. Or compare that to the orgies in Greece and Rome, and the forms of entertainment where they would just witness people eaten alive and slaughtered as a form of entertainment. Yes, there's violent entertainment nowadays, but it's all simulated. We're not actually watching the dinosaurs eat people in Jurassic Park. And that's what they used to do. They used to burn women alive in this country, claiming they were witches. They used to drown women and say if they could swim, they were a witch. And if they drowned, well, at least now we know they weren't. Nowadays, even simulating drowning somebody is a major crime. I don't know what it is, but Bush got in a lot of trouble for Abu Ghraib. We are more sensitive to the treatment of other human beings than ever before in history. And the vast majority of us genuinely care about each other. And we don't have in-group, out-group treatment where we consider other groups subhuman. Yes, some segments of our population still think that way, but the vast majority of us are far more moral than we ever were. And that includes other metrics that you wouldn't even think are that hazardous, like sexuality and sex. I was very surprised that the statistics when it comes to millennial dating habits relative to our parents' generation, they were less moral when it came to sexuality. And there were more abortions out of our parents' generation. It's messed up. So no, that's not a sign of the end either. And I would just go through, if this is still a concern of yours, if there's any doubt in your mind that you're thinking, oh, we're living in the last days, just go through each point of what are supposed prophecies that are happening in front of us, and look into the data and see, is there any truth to any of these claims that earthquakes are worse, or food shortages are worse, or animalistic behavior is on the rise? None of it is true, and if you doubt that, just do the research. I would say, with the bigger lesson to get out of this is not just not to worry that the world is going to end, but that we are part of the world, and we can make it whatever we want it to be by contributing what we have to offer. And we're not going to do a good job of that if we're sitting around whining about how bad things are and how it's worse than it's ever been and how people are terrible. Because first of all, it's not true. But second of all, there's so many things to be grateful for that you're missing out on if all you do is complain all the time about the direction we're headed. In our lifetime, we've decoded the human genome with CRISPR. It is amazing the things that we are going to witness in our life, because now that it is decoded and editable like software, we are going to be able to do amazing things with life and intelligence and disease. And that's another thing that's not on the rise, pestilence. Black plague wiped out a quarter of Europe. The bubonic plague is not gonna do that to us because we have outsmarted it. And smallpox and lice and fleas and things that were just a part of the human condition for all of human history are gone. Our quality of life, if you're the poorest among us, is higher than the wealthy king 200 years ago. And we're whining about how this is the end of the world. Unacceptable. We have so much to look forward to, and our kids have even more to look forward to. We have not only discovered our evolutionary history, but we have now implemented evolution into our technology to where the best engineers of the future will be computer algorithms that mimic evolution. We've already done it in some cases. It requires a lot of computational power and processing power, but we're improving that every day as well. And this process, we understand the basic mechanisms of it, is you take a handful of the best designs and you breed them together and kill off all the rest, and you keep breeding those over and over again. And whatever parameters you put into that software, it designs for you and solves the problems you didn't even consider as problems. This blind process is a better designer than the best engineers on the planet. We have a antenna floating around in space right now that was designed by this process that was better designed than all of the competitor engineers. And that is just one example, but we're improving that technology. It's going to get better and better. And we'll be able to apply that genetic algorithm to what we've now digitized the human genome. Sorry. Anyway, the point is, we can apply that technology to genetic code. We can, nanotechnology is going to make huge improvements in the cost of various materials. 3D printing is going to reduce the cost of raw materials and basic necessities of life. And all of these things are converging and moving exponentially. Exponentially means instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it goes 2, 4, 6, 8. And by the 30th step, you're at 1 billion. The device I'm communicating to you with right now is the result of an exponential improvement that has been continuing for 30 years now. And literally, price per performance is 1 billion fold. And what we're able to do with a cell phone compared to what we would need an entire room to do 30 years ago. There are so many things to be optimistic and excited about and to get involved in, especially on behalf of our children, that it is a travesty to sit around and complain about the condition of human nature and how things have gotten worse because they haven't, and to use that as an excuse to not help build the better world that our kids have to look forward to. All right, thanks for your time.